something like 40% of purchasers are now being influenced by either environmental or ethical reasoning.
Ethics is basically how we treat each other in society.
Many more organisations are looking at ethics because they see it as being the sort of, as it were, the heart and soul of the operation.
In video 1, we looked at the nature of business ethics in terms of business relationships and a company's responsibility to society, investors, customers, employees and other organisations. We looked at the benefits which accrue to companies who strive to be ethical. In this video, we'll focus much more on how ethical issues directly affect your company, the problems to be overcome, and the implications for various parts of your organisation. Any discussion of the ethics of an organisation must begin by looking at the nature of the organisation itself.
In every organisation, there's a corporate ethics programme running. Now, it may well be implicit, it may be to a large extent unspoken, but the reality is that it's there. And it comes through in all sorts of different ways.
The language may be new and the ideas may be new, but the actual ethical behaviour, behaving decently with integrity and honesty and loyalty, that's something that many businesses, including perhaps even especially medium-sized and small businesses and family businesses, have been doing for years.
A company's ethical policy, therefore, is not going to be found in a textbook, and it won't be dictated by law. It must come from within the organisation.
I think when you're talking about something that is as nebulous as ethics or codes of conduct, which you're talking about the very framework of the culture of the business, a culture cannot be imposed. It has to grow from within. It has to come out of behaviours, not be imposed on them.
A code of ethics ought to represent the ethos or the spirit of the organisation. It's very difficult to see how you can simply take somebody else's spirit and say, well, this is exactly identical to ours. I doubt very much if that's the case. It seems to me quite wrong to take somebody else's code of ethics and say we're going to use that for ourselves. I can't see how that could possibly, in any meaningful or accurate way, certainly, represent the ethos of different organisations.
A company should ask itself the following questions. What is the history of our company? What are its aims and goals? And what view of the company would someone outside the business have? There's a widespread misapprehension that ethics is just a matter of obeying the law. In many cases, what is lawful is not ethical.
Very often there is a change in the law following public perception. I think, for instance, the law on insider trading is interesting. A couple of years ago it was not against the law in this country, but a lot of people were being harmed by it. A lot of people were losing out, small investors and so on. And so Parliament said there is a lot of harm being done here, and we've got to stop it. And very often that's the purpose of a law. When a lot of harm is being done and people are already behaving unethically, then the government steps in and says this has reached such a pitch of harm that we're now going to pass a law and prevent it. So what it means is that ethics sits in judgment on the law and can lead to new legislation or indeed to the repeal of bad legislation.
Ethical policies, which include measures for monitoring and enforcement, can help to prevent breaches of the law occurring and so protect company reputation.
To rely upon the law in all respects as being the only guide is probably a mistake. And it's probably better to think very closely about having a framework which perhaps kicks in long before someone would get close to breaking the law. And that gives an early warning that there might be problems around if there are ethical breaches.
Can your company satisfy the law without being ethical? What safeguards could an ethical policy put into place to prevent breaches of the law? It is sometimes assumed that conducting business in an ethical way will have a negative impact on profits. In practice, however, many businesses have found that good ethics is good business. Two companies which have both experienced rapid growth and increasing profitability in the last few years are Time Computer Systems of Simonstone and the Cooperative Bank.
Profit is important, but the standards of how we do that business are important to us. I think it has a very clear bottom line benefit, but the fact that we do get a lot of recommendations from existing customers and past customers speaks very highly of our meeting of the standards that we're trying to set. 4.5 years ago, we were turning over around £2.5 million. Today, we're looking at a year of £100 million of turnover. So there's been a big benefit in maintaining the standards that we have worked to get the growth that we have, to create jobs, which is very important indeed.
It's quite acceptable to be both profitable on the one hand and ethical on the other hand at the same time. We're finding that our profits have increased year on year for the last 3 or 4 years, more than they ever did do in the past. We're not saying that all our success is down to ethical business or ethical trading, but we can certainly find a lot of our success rooted in the way that we've publicised the fact that we're ethical and the way in which it's brought new business.
One of the biggest problems that people often raise in talking about ethics is, oh gracious, the last thing we want to do is put ourselves on some sort of ethical pedestal, because there's nothing people in this country like better than knocking people off pedestals. Even if those people have helped to put that organisation or individual on the pedestal, they still like knocking them off. A lot of ethics is about being wise before the event. So having set out one's ethical stall, one can then say, that was not the norm. That's not the way people in this company behave. And people outside will believe that, because they will say that's certainly the case. Because every time I've had contact with that company, I've had great service, great quality, terrific responsiveness. And these in the end are all ethical issues. And they're down to the behaviour of individual staff members.
If your organisation was the subject of a scandal surrounding the actions of one of its members, would the public see it as an act of an individual or as typical of the organisation? One way of examining the impact of ethical issues on the business as a whole is to look at how ethics will affect relationships. The success of an ethical policy will depend on the organisation's commitment to consultation. We'll look at the ways in which the company can put this consultative process into operation by dealing with practical issues involved in each of the following relationships: employees, customers, investors, suppliers, and society. If an ethical policy is to represent the ethos of an organisation, then one of the first objections likely to be raised by employees is that ethics is a matter of personal standards and morality, and consequently not something that business should be involved in.
Frankly, companies can't afford not to be involved, because it's the individual behaviours of their individual members of staff that will in large part determine its reputation, because they are dealing day and daily with customers, they are dealing day and daily with other members of staff. If there are low levels of trust in the organisation, you can pretty well guarantee it there'll be higher levels of cost.
Although personal ethics may differ, it is vital that an organisation has an ethical policy, because the individual acts of employees in the course of business are the acts of their company. It's important that companies communicate their ethical policy effectively. Some methods of improving communication between the company and its employees are feedback, representation, education and training, regulation.
We often ask our staff about 5 or 6 times a year through attitude surveys various of our procedures and practices. Are they working? Are they good? Are they reliable? Are they trustworthy? And then from those sort of attitude surveys we hold a numbers of forums, employee forums, which are led by one of my colleagues who in a non-threatening and a non-directive way, explores issues, saying just what lay behind the answers of people on this. Is this an issue? Is this a problem?
We used to have an in-house magazine that went out 2 or 3 times a year. They've asked us to increase that now. It goes out 6 times a year. And within that are pages just on green topics, on ethical topics, and they want more all the time. So their participation is almost on demand.
We're hoping that our staff will become involved through our ethical committee. There is 2 staff representatives on that committee. They will be able to bring a viewpoint, a perspective, when they look at the kind of decisions the Trust Board is taking. Now, we also have a responsibility to publicise the work of the ethical committee so that there's an increasing understanding among staff as to why it's there.
First of all, we've got a staff council, which are elected members within the organisation. We've got a very active trade union that are involved within, all get briefings, all participate in a lot of the things that we do regarding the ethical policy.
Every week and every month we're running various training courses to help people get better at what they're doing, always remembering that the standards and the ethics we're trying to work to are embroidered and woven into the whole fabric of what we're doing.
I would think roughly every member of the Dixon sales staff gets something like about 7 or 8 days worth of training a year in one form or another. And we spend an enormous amount of money on it.
One of the ways in which organisations attempt to communicate an ethical policy is through a code of conduct. Many companies in the UK now have a code, and some examples can be found at the back of the handbook. But first, it's important to understand what a code of conduct can and cannot do.
One of the biggest mistakes I think that any company can make is to assume that simply producing a code of ethics, perhaps written by a couple of folks in a darkened room somewhere, and then sending it out to all staff, is in some way setting some ethical tone in the organisation. That's not the case. It's not that way at all. In fact, it has to be part of an ethics process. The code is a good starting point, but that's what it is. It's a good starting point. It's the point at which a company has actually said, this is it. This is what we believe in. These are the standards that we think are important for our staff, for our customers, for the community, for our investors, etc. That's a great first step, but it is only a first step.
It's a new statement. This is how we intend to behave and how we intend our employees to behave. So it's the beginning of something. And if it's looked on as an end in itself, then I think it can become easily ethical wallpaper, it can become lip service, it can become a matter really of bad faith and disillusionment and so on. Whereas if it's part of a wider program, then it can be very important as something that the public can appeal to, as something that employees can appeal to say, you know, if they're being pressurized from inside the company, they can say, look, this is against our code of conduct. As something for shareholders to appeal to, as something for new employees and recruits to be attracted to, and undesirable recruits and employees to be dissuaded from. So it has all sorts of constructive uses, but only as part of a wider package.
It's crucially important to get it right. It's not the sort of thing that one can say, oh, we got that wrong. The staff didn't like it, so we'll go off and do it again. I'm sorry, it can't be done again. It's awfully important to get it right from the very beginning. The best way to do that is to consult with staff. It's the hard way, but at the end of the day, it's the way that produces the best returns on the effort involved.
I think it's very easy for senior managers, boards of managers, to issue edicts about this is our mission statement, this is our code of conduct. If it's to have any chance of being accepted and acted upon, very importantly, by the staff in the organisation, it seems to me sensible that you need to devise some process by which the staff in the organisation can have an input into whatever the code or the mission statement looks like. And we've given our ethical committee a particular remit to review our existing mission statement and go through a process of amending it if it thinks it's so required.
So, effective communication of your ethical policy requires feedback, representation, education and training, regulation. Some questions that arise as a result of our discussion so far are: do the actions of your company reflect your own standards of behaviour? Are your actions consistent with the ethical policy of your company? How could your company improve internal communications? How important is a code of conduct to the success of an ethical policy? Further questions relating to the communication of an ethical policy can be found in a separate section of the handbook on page 17.
Because the markets are getting more and more competitive, whether it's in restaurants, whether it's in products, whether it's in supermarkets, the ethical consumer is getting more and more discerning. They are making decisions about the products that they're buying according to how they feel about them. And if they feel that a company is trying to portray a certain image, and then they have something that is juxtapositioned against that image, then they'll most likely go somewhere else because they will have lost belief in that company.
I believe in setting up a relationship with customers if they trust you. If they come in and you're going to sell a product and they know that if it goes wrong or it's not right, you'll change it for them. There ain't any hassle. They learn to trust you and they'll come back.
We are a business run by human beings, and human beings do make mistakes. So there's going to be some people who felt that maybe because something went wrong, we are not as good as they wanted us to be. Then it's how we have dealt with resolving their difficulties and putting that matter right for them. So they go away knowing they've had a problem, but feeling comfortable that we have gone about resolving it in the right way for them.
You have to show the integrity of your service. You have to build it over years. I think every organisation has millions and millions of transactions, and a few do go wrong, but you've got to put them right. But it is building the integrity of your service. It is building proper relationships with your customers, proper relationships with your staff, that will eventually give you better business. We have, for instance, a rule that you don't serve relatives. So what happens if a relative comes into the shop and quite naturally says, I want to deal with my brother or my sister? We've got to protect the employee from misapprehension by his colleagues, by being put in a situation that may cause him to behave either unethically or even illegally. We've won a number of national training awards, 2 or 3 of those over the last 4 or 5 years. We've also won an award for our Mastercare servicing engineers, which shows that they also provide very good service to the customers. We want them to be right up to date with the best ways of dealing with customers' problems.
My own trust board does feel very accountable to the people who use our services, for the kind of decisions they take and the kind of service that's provided. We do have a number of our trust board meetings in public, in addition to the statutory annual public meeting. And we've had some very good feedback from staff and the public who have in fact attended those meetings.
We have found, for instance, in clarifying our particular relationships in dealing with suppliers, it clears the air both for the suppliers and for our own staff. They know what is acceptable behaviour and what is not acceptable behaviour. And things like bribes, gifts and hospitalities are made much clearer now. It makes it easier to do business. I've often said that if there are bribes around, it shows that we still haven't got the bottom price. So that in itself perhaps may help us to get a better cash relationship.
I think supplier relationships are a particularly difficult ethical issue here, because people who are in purchasing areas have certain pressures and temptations that come their way that wouldn't apply to many other people in the organisation, simply because they do a completely different sort of job. And it's not unknown for suppliers to say, hey, I would like you to have this, simply because you've been a good customer, etc., etc. And to some extent people would say, well, what's wrong with that? But at the same time, there will be people who will approach a company and say, I'd like you to have this, but I would prefer no one else knows about it. That should ring all the alarm bells. A, because it's not true. In other words, as sure as eggs, somebody else is going to find out about it. And I often say to people in purchasing areas, If you don't want to see that decision you took appear in the local papers tomorrow morning, don't make it. If you can't explain it to your members of your family, don't do it.
It's well known in business that a company will phone you up and say, I'd like to buy 1,000 units, what will be the special price for that? You'll give that price and they come back with an order for 100 and expect the 100 to be met at the 1,000 price. That is not an ethical way of using volume to dictate price. So we feel it's very important to be honest and open with our suppliers. If we are, then we get the product and the quality that we're looking for with the delivery dates that are needed.
One of the greatest obstacles to improved supplier relationships is the prompt payment of bills.
In fairness, I mean, most of our suppliers, if you don't pay on time, they put you on stop. So in order to keep the business going, you have to pay on time. Unfortunately, it doesn't apply to all of your customers. We do find that the bigger the customer, the longer they take to pay.
Late payment of bills, it seems to me, is a crucial ethical issue, because there a level of trust has been set and it's been broken. And then the problem with that is it could become endemic. In other words, company A doesn't pay their bills in time, company B then decides it's not going to pay its bills in time. Then company C decides it's going to be a late payer. Before we know where we are, right, we're all back in an unethical, right, late paying mess. And that can't be good for anyone. It's not good for customers, it's not good for business, and it's not good for staff.
The obvious duty any company has towards its investors is to provide a return on their investment. Increasingly, however, investors are becoming more interested in how that return is generated.
Some people's view of ethical investment is to say to their broker or their advisor, do not invest in the following companies, whatever those companies may be, because I disapprove of their activities, I disapprove of what they do. They are what I would call the negative ethical investor. Then there are different levels of positive ethical investor, the people who say to their advisor, only invest in the following companies because I approve of them. But then there's been the growing emergence of what I would call the very active ethical investor, the person who buys shares in a company of whom they completely disapprove, because that entitles them to go to the AGM and ask questions about the company's ethics. And if people are going to turn up at annual general meetings and ask ethical questions, then it seems to make sense to be in a position to be able to answer those questions. Or better still, prevent the question. And that means overhauling the organisation ethically.
Investors at the Cooperative Bank were actively involved in the formation of the bank's ethical policy.
We would recommend doing it the way we've done it, which is going out and asking your customers what they want. Why did they join you? They'll tell you if you ask them, whatever brought them to you. And if you were to say, are there things that you don't want us to do? I'm sure, again, they'll tell you. Will you build or sell anything to any person at any time, anywhere, for any reason? And I think if you start asking those questions, that will draw out some sort of ethical code or practice that you can introduce yourselves. It is possible. It's not as hard as it sounds. And it's not as life-threatening in terms of business as people can think, because we've brought new business in on the back of this. When we first codified the policy back in 1992, the first place we had to look, obviously, was at our own book and say, well, who have we got on our books? And there were fox hunts and there were rabbit farms, intensive rabbit farms, and a whole range of organisations that clearly couldn't stay, and we had to ask them to leave. And we continually appraise all our businesses to make sure that there are none that are actually in conflict. There are bound to be some at some stage that we're going to find that have changed their business and so on. So we do annual appraisals to make sure that they're all staying within the policy. We owe that to the rest of the customers to be able to do that.
Improving the company's relationship with the investor would involve developing a greater level of awareness of the ethics of the company and the ethical concerns of the investor.
So society, it seems to me, has changed its requirements. And after all, business operates as part of society. That's where the customers are, that's where the investors are. So therefore, if society changes its standards, and has become much more interested in the ways that a company operates, and particularly its ethics, then business has to respond to that.
Any organisation has got to ensure that the decisions it takes have some validity, not just with the staff that it employs, but with the outside world.
R.E. Andrews of the Dixons Group outlines some of the ways in which Dixons have developed the idea of social responsibility.
One of the things that we have fostered for some time now is a relationship with a major charity. We actually polled all our employees and asked which charity they wish to support, and for the last 2 or 3 years they've supported the NSPCC, and we encourage them to raise money by all the many methods that people do raise money, and we match it. Whatever they raise, we the company give to them as well. We also get very involved with the Bradford City Technology College that we founded in 1990. And this is a very successful inner city comprehensive school which offers free education to inner city children in Bradford. And we find that is one way of our trying to help the children and their education, especially in the inner cities. We have an Employee Community Service Award scheme, which each year we pick out about 8 or so employees who in their own time have devoted their particular efforts towards helping some local charity.
This level of investment outside the organisation may seem to be possible for only the largest organisations, but commitment to community involvement is equally important for smaller businesses.
I think if you're part of a small town, you should be part of a small town and help that small town to put on the map and do what it wants to do. And we do support local charities too. But people respect you for doing that.
We did some research not long back where we tried to find out how many people were involved in various organisations. And I recommend other companies doing it, large and small, to find out how many school governors you've got on in your workforce, how many people you've got working on PTAs, school PTAs, how many people you've got helping credit unions, and all sorts of other voluntary activity. You'll find that there are all sorts of people involved outside work in things that are probably more ethical than they would be in work.
Establishing an ethical policy works for the benefit of all: employees, customers, investors, suppliers, and society. The greatest benefactor, however, is the organisation itself.
Well, it's a piece of received wisdom in business that good ethics is good business. And there are many ways in which this is obvious. Look at the companies that we all respect. Precisely because they have a reputation for honest dealing, for integrity and so on, then we buy from them and we go back and we become repeat purchasers from them. So being ethical for them pays.
Even in the short term, though it's always been accepted in the medium and the long term, but even in the short term, good ethics is probably good business.